Marvel Snap just dropped their most recent OTA, and this one is a big one. Let's start with the Falcon in the room. Sam Wilson is getting a point of power taken off of him. I have had a great deal of angst about this kind of change to Sam Wilson because I think the immediate reaction that I had and that I expect others to have is that this will not meaningfully change the card. I do think that power changes are the direction to go, but I think I might have preferred them going a little bit harder on Sam Wilson, in part due to his wild ubiquity. I don't know exactly what going to 2-2 will do. I do think that there is more of a chance in the world we're entering that this is a card that does fall off the same way that Iron Patriot fell off a great deal, which is to say, the perception of the card being weaker might be a little bit stronger than the reality of the card being weaker. The issue is that Sam has so many synergies that it just makes sense to play him in a bunch of good decks anyway. If you're playing Kraven or Miles Morales, you're going to want Sam as a move enabler. If you're playing something along the lines of an ongoing deck or a deck with Mockingbird in it, you're going to want Sam to do that. And in light of that, I think that they probably should have gone a little bit harder on his scaling or on his base power, because I think that he has all of these built-in homes where he's already going to be played for synergy. My instinct would be to take him out of the decks where he is not going to be played for synergy. I.e., at 2-1, for example, you still probably play him in ongoing decks, you still consider him in Thanos decks, but you don't play him in literally everything. And I think that that is sort of the direction they would want to go. My instinct is, I think, 2-3 and reduce the scaling to +1, or 2-1 flat out would have been an option that I would have gone for, given the fact that they are not going to be doing an OTA for a month after this one. I think that they approached this OTA in a way to sort of err on the side of caution. It would be bad to release a card that was this good and then make it unplayable. I just don't know that 2-2 does enough to actually fix what is the problem with Sam Wilson, which is his general ubiquity. It's also worth talking about the fact that a lot of the decks he has synergy with are strong for reasons that are kind of related to him, but also kind of related to them. Thanos, for example, is a home for Sam Wilson because it is a Mockingbird deck and very often an ongoing deck. Ongoing decks are homes for Sam Wilson naturally because they scale with cards that are ongoing, and he is two of those cards, right? And so you have these decks that sort of naturally want to do what he does. Scream with Kraven and Miles, right? All of those things are very strong right now, and I do think this is worth saying, would probably be very strong without Sam Wilson. So when I look at this card being played, I think a lot of people look at this guy and say he's generically applicable, but a lot of that is that 3 decks, give or take, counting Thanos as 2 different decks, that were and are already good, are using him. You have Sam Wilson being played in the Abomination variant of Afflict, and normal Afflict is plenty good, but there's a Sam Wilson version of it, and so you have this card that typically has more synergies than you would think it does at first glance, and because of those synergies, is able to sort of bring these decks along with it and rise with a tide that makes it sort of hard to extricate why the decks are good. Because I think that Afflict is good anyway. I think that Thanos is good anyway. I think that ongoing stuff has just gotten a lot of help and is probably good anyway. But Sam is making them all better. And so this perception of his ubiquity is, there's this idea that he's like a generic good card, like an Iron Patriot. And I think more Sam decks are using him for what he does than the alternative. My instinct is that they should probably not also get an Angela to go along with the free shield that they are using. And I think that that is sort of where I think this nerf might have not exactly gone as far as I would have. Scream is taking a 1 point of power nerf, which I think is frankly long overdue. This card has been the Mr. Negative of her archetype for a very long time, and I think Strange Supreme coming out really solidified for me how messed up this card is, especially compared to Strange Supreme. People are very excited about Mr. Supreme, and I think he's quite good, but Scream makes him look like kind of a joke, honestly. This is a card that scales with cards that are not necessarily great, but like already pretty okay. Polaris is a 3/5. You're not gonna play her in something that isn't working with her, but also you get to play a 3/5 when you don't draw Scream, compared to things like Squirrel Girl being played for Strange Supreme. In addition, one of the main things that sticks out about Strange Supreme is all of his points are on him, and he centralizes those points out of your other lanes. Whereas Scream distributes her power so that even if you Shadow King her, or Shang-Chi her, if somehow she gets to that level, she still has applied all of these negative debuffs to other lanes than the one that she is in. In addition to that, the Strange Supreme has an even larger impact in the sense of he eats stuff out of your other lanes in order to get his trigger. He is inherently making himself more vulnerable to the tech that Scream is already even less vulnerable to. When you compare the two, there genuinely is, and I realize this is kind of a hack thing to say, no comparison. Scream scales more per proc. They both happen once a turn. The cards Scream goes with are better. She is a better card against the counterplay that is available. It's just unbelievable how much better Scream is than Strange Supreme as a build around. The one thing that Strange Supreme really has going for it is that he has natural inbuilt synergy with Thanos, which is already a really, really, really good card. And I think that that is really a lot of what's keeping him afloat right now. But when you make that one-to-one comparison, it becomes very clear that this card is a bit of a problem. And I think it'd be reasonable to describe this card as more than a bit of a problem. This is an extremely, extremely powerful card that is extremely, extremely powerful stuff. Losing a point of power, I genuinely don't even know if that's going to make a major impact, but it should at least allow Red Guardian to be a more viable piece of counterplay. Again, Scream has really pushed the envelope on how good a 2/2 can be, because she's not a 2/2. You get one proc off her, she's a 2/6. You get two procs off her, she's a 2/10. But it's distributed in such a way that it's very difficult to tech against her in meaningful ways. There's no one-card solution to her. You have Shadow King, you have maybe a Shang-Chi if you're lucky, but you're probably not that lucky. You have Luke Cage. All of the tech cards against this card only deal with half of what she does. And so this is a card that has the biggest number of scaling of any of the scaling 2-drops, and also is the least vulnerable to tech. It seems like a very obvious balance outlier, and this is just an easy nerf to make. When Captain Carter was released, I said that I was surprised that they went with such an inflexible card as the Season Pass card. It felt like a card that was very difficult to buff, a card that was very difficult to nerf either, because if this card gets better, if the numbers on it get bigger, it might just be a really scary thing. And if the numbers on it get smaller, there's some very obvious Silver Surfer synergy that this card can then become a major part of. And they have decided that they're just cool with that. Captain Carter to 3/2 is a very interesting thing to do, especially in the context of Silver Surfer being a deck that not only runs, of course, Silver Surfer, but already runs Galacta. That makes this card a big threat if you're able to fill up the spaces behind it. I would expect it to actually push Silver Surfer into more Sam Wilsons just because of how much it values having bodies on the board. But maybe this is a world where we do ongoing Silver Surfer and we play actual Captain America, Sam Wilson, and Captain Carter all of a sudden, and we're running like a Captain package in here as a way of getting a bunch of power onto the board. Maybe we can even try stuff like speed. There's a lot to think about when it comes to building this deck, I think. But what I am fairly sure of is that this helps Captain Carter's play pattern a great deal. One of the big weaknesses that this card had is that it wanted to be in the first or second spot on a location, and it cost 4, and that's not overwhelmingly likely. Another of the big weaknesses this card had is that it was very difficult to play it and then fill up the spaces behind it as you went into the turn. This is another play pattern that is alleviated by her simply getting less expensive. So even outside of all of the things that this could do for a Silver Surfer deck or an ongoing Silver Surfer deck, what it really does is make this card a legitimate threat in a very decent amount of decks. This is a card that I think is kind of actually scary the second it gets a buff on it. And because it is so much cheaper, it has to carry much less of the load of the deck. As a 4, it had to do a lot. As a 3, its competition is much, much, much weaker, and it is much more able to stand out amongst that competition. I've talked about the previously announced buff to Infinity Ultron going to 5/8. I think this is a bit of a larger buff than people expect it to be. There have been some real rumblings among top players about the Danish Hela build, including this card instead of Legion recently. I think that is a likely direction for this to go. This is still a card that wants you to ramp it out if you can, but at 5/8, it becomes much less of a requirement. I think this card has a shot at being a generically applicable 5, just the kind of thing you can put in your deck if you are doing what it wants you to do anyway. I think that this makes it a much more playable card in those Quinjet Misery decks. Previously, I was pretty convinced that by putting him in those decks, if you were doing like Quinjet V-Hand Misery, you were probably throwing compared to just running Kahori at 5/8. I think he can do a lot of damage in those decks now, and I think that's a really interesting spot for him. It becomes a lot more interesting in Silver Surfer because you can run like Luna Snow, Sarah, and this. God forbid you do all of those as a curve. Obviously, that's a really cool thing to do. So I think that Silver Surfer, Hela, and the Misery V-Hand decks all need to take a long look at this guy and at least do their due diligence to make sure he isn't a lot better, because I think there's a real chance that one of those is a place that he is going to legitimately be able to stick. How the Mighty Have Fallen. Toxin is a card that when you just look at the numbers, it's very hard to believe is not already amazing, and yet here it is getting a buff, in large part because what it tries to do is be in a strategy that lacks the ability to compete on points with a lot of other stuff. Now, I'm not talking about move bounce here, which is just a very difficult deck to play to begin with and is happy to get the extra point of power. What I am talking about is actual bounce, which has, I won't even say necessarily been power crept out of the game. It's a deck that is pretty close to playable, but it just sort of feels like you're on the back foot against a lot of different stuff, just due to the point ceiling that the game currently has. When you're playing a bounce deck, unless you are getting like a really sick nut draw, your Hitmonkey is going to be pretty reasonably large, but far from the largest thing on the board. Maybe you got like a Joaquin Torres Rocketing Groot that's really awesome, but ultimately, I think the point output of the deck is relatively lackluster, and obviously this does help it. It's just kind of crazy that we've gotten to the point that like a card like Toxin can actually get a buff, and I'm just like, yeah, that's probably not going to change much for bounce. As far as move bounce, I don't know that this changes too much, but every point goes a long way in that deck, because if there is a weakness to move bounce, and there definitely is, I would say that that weakness is that it's typically very easy to win one lane, but a little bit harder to win 2 lanes. And so the more you're able to cobble together like Toxin Sage stuff to go along with your 30 power Vulture or whatever, every little bit of power counts in those situations, and they are unfortunately a lot more common than you think. So I actually think this could be a meaningful change in the context of move bounce, just because of how important every power can be. Penny Parker's Spider, which is how I'm going to pronounce SP//DR, because frankly, I don't know how to pronounce it other than that. Her Evangelion is getting a buff to 3/4. I don't think this does too much for her. My instinct with Penny Parker is that her real problem is that she's a card that makes sense in Wiccan decks, but her payoff doesn't make sense in Wiccan decks. A 2/3 that gives you a bigger card, you're interested in that. A 2/3 that gives you a card, you can curve into your Wiccan, you're down. You're down when that happens. She's just not big enough and not relevant enough in terms of the payoff. And going to 2/7, yeah, like, technically a 5/7, right? But like, why is it not 3/5 or 2/4 on Penny, where this is like a build your own vulture over a couple of turns? I don't know. Or not vulture, sorry, vision. Like, this is a card that I think there are two major issues with. The first is going to 5 energy, if you're planning on playing Wiccan, doesn't help you at all, because the only one drop you play is Quicksilver a lot of the time. The second is that this is not the most wonderful thing to do on rate, because, okay, yeah, you have your 5, maybe that makes sense, it's very, very cool, but moving early isn't really all that relevant. The ability to move is way better on turn 6 than literally every other turn of the game by a lot. And so the fact that this is able to move next turn and you're incentivized to play it in order to get your ramp down, it's a little bit awkward. Now, they did just buff Infinity Ultron. This is a card that creates cards. Maybe there's something there in terms of this being an alternate ramp into Infinity Ultron option that people maybe forgot about. I think that there could be something interesting to do in a world like that, where you are interested in putting cards in your hand for various other effects, or you're interested in ramping into Infinity Ultron anyway. Things like that are kind of cool. I don't know if it's going to be worth doing, but it is something to investigate. Maybe try this in the Misery V-Hand Infinity Ultron list. Fastos is getting a point of power, going to 3/4. This makes him much, much, much closer to playability. When it comes to 3 drops, every bit of power matters. Going from 3/3 to 3/4 is a really impactful thing. I guess that's not true only of 3 drops, but 3 drops is a space where there's just so much competition that you really feel every point of power. This is a card that got meaningfully better here. I don't know if it's enough to make it a great option, but I know it's a card that people want to play already, and now this card that people want to play will be much more justifiable for them to actually play. I think that's probably a good thing on the whole. You could see it maybe in some Thanos lists or in various Silver Surfer lists. It is far more justifiable, and it was already seeing Fringe play in those decks. I think it is now slightly better than Fringe in those decks. Last up is Rhino, going to 3/6 and getting an all-new ability. That's right, they finally reworked this card, and it actually looks kind of sweet. This is a 3/6 that adds a rock to your side of the location you play it on. Now, I know you're thinking, hey, that's not sweet at all. I hate having a rock. But 3/6 is pretty nice, and they just released Strange Supreme, and this guy might be his new best friend. This is a card that works with Viper in clog decks. This is a 3/6 with upside that you kind of have to build around, but also you get to fully, or downside that you can build around to make it upside, but you also get the option of totally eliding that downside by just playing him on the last turn of the game as a 3/6. I think this card is genuinely interesting. People were already trying Strange Supreme Surfer stuff. I'm not saying this moves the needle there necessarily, but any 3/6 is probably worth looking at a lot in anything that can mitigate the downside, because of how competitive 3s are. And so this is the kind of card that, like, it might actually be like a solid budget option for people. I don't think it's ever going to be necessarily the best option unless you're, doing Strange Supreme and or Viper type things. But just the ability for this card to not have a downside if you play it on the final turn of the game, or even to like make it upside with something like Mojo World, I do think this is actually like kind of a decent card now, and I'm actually pretty happy to see that. The elephant in the room is that I'm very sad I started this video off by saying the Falcon in the room, and I didn't end it by saying the Rhino in the room. That's on me. I'll do better next time, I promise. The actual elephant in the room is that they're not doing an OTA in the middle of May. The next OTA or patch, I believe, is in the 29th of May. So we're going to have a month with this metagame. I don't know if this OTA is big enough to satisfy people's desires for change in the meta in that context. I think directionally it is aimed at the right things. Sam Wilson, Scream, Captain Carter, Infinity Ultron. Those are things that are aimed in the right direction. Reworking Rhino and then saying they plan on doing further reworks like this more often, also aimed in the right direction. Doing that the day that you guys decide to not do any patches for a month, I kind of think maybe they needed to be a little more drastic. And maybe this is just, me with content creator ADHD brain talking. But I think I would have tried something like 2-0 Scream, 2-1 Sam Wilson. I think I would have been aggressive with this in the context of knowing that there weren't going to be patches for a little bit of time. And I think that that is something that they probably should have done, or at least it's what I would have done were I in their shoes. It's possible they did account for this. I think that if this were a normal OTA on the 2-week cadence, people would be very happy with this one. It is meaningfully at least aimed in the right direction. But as is, I think people might feel as though this isn't enough for the gap that they are leaving. And I'm not sure it is. Basically, if Sam Wilson still sticks around, my big worry is that not necessarily that Sam Wilson will be in every deck, but that there's not really a good reason for me to cut it from my Kraven deck. There's not really a good reason for me to cut it from my Thanos deck. There's not really a good reason for me to cut it from my Afflict deck. And there's not really a good reason for me to cut it from kind of any of those. In fact, they've added more good reasons for me to play it in my Surfer deck. And so I do think we could be in line for another metagame that is fairly Sam Wilson heavy. What I'm really interested in is it okay for a card to be everywhere if it's not broken? Because all of these decks are explicitly leveraging Sam Wilson, and he has all these built-in synergies. Is it okay for things to be about the synergies that he has? Because he has synergies with so much stuff, he can sort of be a role player in a bunch of stuff. Right now, he's a star in a bunch of stuff. I think being a role player in a bunch of stuff is actually probably an okay spot for him, but I worry they might have left him too high. It's kind of why I would have preferred 2-1. As always, I have been KMBest. Let me know what you think in the comments. Yes, I just hit the microphone, and I will see you in the next one.